Part 3. Danny's mind worked frantically through his limited options as the massive Rexmaw moved closer with slow, deliberate steps that spoke of absolute confidence, because this creature had no natural predators, and it knew that everything on this planet was either prey or competition, and Danny was definitely prey. Running would be completely pointless because the Rexmaw could reach speeds of 60 kilometers per hour, and Danny was exhausted and weighed down by the increased gravity, and navigating treacherous terrain in the darkness, and he would be caught within seconds. Fighting was equally absurd because he had nothing but a multi-tool against a creature that was 15 meters of armored muscle and teeth and venom that could paralyze him in under 30 seconds. That left only one option, which was to be smarter than the predator and use the environment against it. The Rexmaw continued its approach, and Danny could see its eyes now, which were multiple sets arranged around a massive skull that seemed to be mostly mouth-filled with teeth designed for tearing and crushing, and the creature's armored plating was thick and overlapping like the scales of some prehistoric monster from Earth. But Danny knew that armor always had weak points because every creature had vulnerabilities, and the key to survival was finding those vulnerabilities and exploiting them before the creature could exploit his. He started backing slowly toward the nearest steam vent while keeping his movement smooth and steady because sudden movements would trigger the predator's chase instinct and make it attack immediately. The Rexmaw followed him with patient, measured steps because it was in no particular hurry, and as far as the creature was concerned, Danny was already dead, and it was just a matter of time before it could feed. Danny reached the steam vent and could feel intense heat radiating through his environmental suit, and his sensors showed the vent was expelling superheated gases at approximately 200 degrees Celsius, which was hot enough to be extremely dangerous to him. But he had no idea what effect it would have on the Rexmaw. The creature lunged forward without any warning, and it covered the distance between them in two massive strides, and Danny threw himself to the side, rolling across the sharp volcanic rock and coming up near the edge of the steam vent, with his heart hammering in his chest. The Rexmaw's momentum carried it past him, and the creature skidded to a halt and turned with surprising agility for something so large, and its eyes fixed on Danny with what seemed like increased interest. Danny positioned himself carefully with the steam vent directly behind him, and he waited with every muscle tensed. The Rexmaw charged again, and this time Danny waited until the absolute last possible second before dropping flat against the ground, and the creature's mass carried it forward, directly into the plume of superheated gases erupting from the vent. The Rexmaw's roar changed instantly from predatory to pained, and it thrashed backward, shaking its massive head violently, and the steam had found the gaps in its armor around its eyes and mouth, where the soft tissue was exposed. It was not a killing blow, and Danny knew that, but it was enough to make the creature reconsider whether he was worth the effort. Danny did not wait to see if the Rexmaw would recover and come after him again, because he sprinted toward the crystalline forest, pushing his exhausted body to its absolute limits and ignoring the burning pain in his legs and lungs. Behind him, he could hear the Rexmaw's enraged bellows echoing across the volcanic plateau, but the sounds grew more distant with each passing second, and the predator had apparently decided that easier prey was available elsewhere. Danny ran until his legs threatened to give out completely, and he finally collapsed against one of the crystalline formations at the edge of the forest, and his heart felt like it might burst from his chest, and the suit's medical monitors were flashing warnings about elevated stress hormones and dangerous muscle fatigue. He allowed himself exactly 2 minutes to recover and catch his breath, and then he forced himself back to his feet, because stopping for too long would let his muscles stiffen and make movement even more difficult. He was in the crystalline forest now, and he needed to understand this new environment quickly before something else tried to kill him. The formations were absolutely fascinating, and they were made of volcanic glass that had been shaped by extreme heat and rapid cooling into towering spires and delicate branches that looked almost like frozen trees, and some formations were perfectly clear, while others were colored in deep shades of red and orange and black. The structures created a maze-like environment that blocked clear sight lines in most directions, but also provided numerous places where he could hide or take shelter. Danny's suit sensors detected movement above him, and he looked up to see small creatures no bigger than rats scurrying through the crystalline branches overhead, and they seemed to be feeding on something, though he could not immediately identify what their food source was. He found a spot where 3 large crystalline formations came together, to create a triangular shelter, and he settled in to rest properly because his body desperately needed recovery time. The chronometer showed 21 hours elapsed since landing, which meant he had 51 hours remaining, and he was past the point where most candidates had died. But that offered only small comfort because the majority of deaths occurred during the second and third days when exhaustion and resource depletion became critical factors. Danny forced himself to eat one of his emergency rations, which was a compressed bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with chemicals, but it provided necessary calories to keep his body functioning. He sipped his recycled water slowly and tried very hard not to think about what the water had been before the filtration system processed it into something drinkable. As dawn broke over Terminus 9, Danny got his first clear look at the crystalline forest in daylight, and it was beautiful in a harsh alien way, because the rising sun caught the glass formations and refracted the light into thousands of rainbow patterns that danced across the rocks. For just a moment, Danny could almost forget that he was on a planet actively trying to kill him. The moment ended abruptly when he spotted bones scattered among the crystalline formations, and they were not recent kills, but old remains that had been bleached by the toxic atmosphere and picked completely clean by scavengers. Danny counted the remains from at least 6 different candidates, and their equipment was corroded beyond any recognition. It was a stark reminder that beauty and death were not mutually exclusive on Terminus 9. Danny spent the morning hours exploring the crystalline forest systematically and mapping routes in his mind and identifying both resources he could use and hazards he needed to avoid. He found another sulfur spring, and this one seemed cleaner than the others he had encountered, so he set up his water recycling system and began processing a fresh supply. He also discovered something completely unexpected, which was edible biomass. The small rat-like creatures he had seen earlier were feeding on a type of fungus that grew in the deep shadows cast by the largest crystal formations, and Danny carefully scanned a sample with his suit's biological analyzer. To his surprise, the scan came back showing the fungus was potentially safe for human consumption, at least in small quantities, because while the fungus contained toxins, they were no more dangerous than many mushrooms found on Earth, and his body's natural systems could process them. Danny carefully harvested a small sample of the fungus and added it to his emergency rations because it was not much, but every single calorie would help him survive. By midday, Danny had established a working routine that involved moving to a new location within the forest every few hours and setting up water processing at each stop and resting in short increments, while staying constantly alert for predators and environmental hazards. The routine was interrupted violently by an earthquake. It started as a low rumble that was barely noticeable at first, but then the ground began shaking with increasing violence, and Danny watched in horror as several of the massive crystalline formations shattered and rained razor-sharp glass fragments down all around him. He ran, blindly dodging falling debris and trying to reach a clearer area where he would not be crushed or shredded by the falling crystal. Part 5, the shuttle docked with orbital station Kepler-7, and Danny stepped out into the docking bay still wearing his battered and corroded environmental suit, and the first thing he noticed was the complete silence that fell over everyone present. There were dozens of beings in the docking bay going about their normal duties, but every single one of them stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at the human who had just accomplished the impossible. Danny walked slowly toward the decontamination area because his legs were still shaky and unreliable after 3 days of fighting gravity and running from predators and climbing cliffs. A Vendorian medical officer rushed forward with scanning equipment and began checking his vital signs while asking rapid questions about his physical condition. Danny answered each question honestly and admitted that he was exhausted and dehydrated and probably malnourished and covered in minor cuts and bruises. But otherwise, he was functional. The medical officer made clicking sounds of amazement and kept scanning him over and over, as if the equipment might be malfunctioning, because the readings showed someone who should be in critical condition, but was somehow still walking and talking. They guided Danny to the medical bay where a full team of doctors from various species waited to examine him and document every aspect of his condition for the official records. The lead physician was a tall Zephron named Clearwater, who explained that they needed to conduct a thorough examination to verify that he had survived without any permanent damage. Danny submitted to the examination patiently, even though all he wanted was to sleep for about 20 hours straight. They took samples of his blood and ran scans of every organ system and tested his reflexes and cognitive function, and asked him to describe in detail everything that had happened during the 72 hours. When the examination finally concluded, Clearwater announced that Danny Morrison was in surprisingly good health considering what he had endured, and that he would make a full recovery with proper rest and nutrition. Danny asked if that meant he could go, and Clearwater replied that he could leave the medical bay, but he was required to report to Sergeant Vex immediately for debriefing. The walk to the training complex felt longer than it should have, and everywhere Danny went he noticed beings stopping to watch him pass and whispering to each other in their various languages. He had become something of a celebrity apparently. The debriefing room was exactly as he remembered it, and Sergeant Vex stood at the front with all four of his eyes fixed on Danny as he entered. The sergeant did not speak for a long moment and simply studied Danny from head to toe, as if trying to understand how this small human had succeeded, where 347 warriors had failed. Finally, Sergeant Vex spoke, and his voice carried a tone that Danny had not heard before, which was something close to respect. The sergeant said that in his entire career spanning over 4 decades, he had sent countless candidates to Terminus 9 and watched every single one of them die, and he had begun to believe that the trial was simply impossible, and that no being in the galaxy possessed the combination of skills and luck and pure stubborn will necessary to survive. But Danny Morrison had proven him wrong. Sergeant Vex asked Danny to explain in his own words what had made the difference between his success and everyone else's failure. Danny thought carefully before answering, because he wanted to give an honest response that might actually help future candidates. He explained that the key was not being stronger or faster or better equipped than the other candidates, but rather being willing to adapt constantly and think creatively and use the environment itself as both weapon and shelter. Danny said that most species in the galaxy evolved on relatively stable worlds where the environment was predictable and safe, and this created a certain way of thinking about survival that did not work on Deathworld's humans evolved on Earth, which was classified as a Class A Deathworld, and this meant that human psychology and human instincts were fundamentally shaped by constant environmental threats. Humans learned over millions of years that the planet itself was the greatest enemy, and that survival required constantly adapting and learning and refusing to give up even when death seemed certain. Danny explained that he had treated Terminus 9 not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a challenge to be navigated, and he had watched the local fauna and learned from their survival strategies, and he had used his knowledge of Earth's dangers to predict similar patterns on an alien world. Sergeant Vex listened intently, and when Danny finished, the sergeant performed the Vendorian salute again and said that Danny had not only passed the Deathworld trial but had done so in a way that would change how the Vanguard approached training forever. The sergeant informed Danny that his performance had been monitored continuously by orbital sensors and that the data would be studied extensively to develop new survival protocols. Then Sergeant Vex smiled, which was a disconcerting expression on a Vendorian face, and told Danny that he was now officially a member of the Vanguard and entitled to all the privileges and responsibilities that came with that status. Danny felt a surge of pride and accomplishment because he had set out to prove that humans belonged among the galaxy's elite warriors, and he had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The sergeant dismissed him and told him to get proper rest because training for actual Vanguard operations would begin in 1 week. Danny left the debriefing room and made his way to the quarters that had been assigned to him, and the moment he entered and saw the bed, he collapsed onto it. Without even removing his boots, he slept for 16 hours straight without dreaming. When he finally woke up, Danny found that his quarters had been restocked with food and supplies, and there was a message waiting for him on his personal communication device. The message was from Kate, and her face appeared on the screen with tears running down her cheeks, and she told him that she had never been so terrified in her entire life, waiting to hear if he had survived. She said that the news of a human surviving the Deathworld trial had spread across Earth within hours, and that Danny was being called a hero by people who had never even met him. Kate told him that their mother had watched the final hours of the trial through the public broadcast, and had cried when the emergency beacon activated, showing he was alive, Danny sent a reply telling Kate that he had kept his promise and come home safely, and that he loved her and would call again soon for a longer conversation. Over the next several days, Danny gave numerous interviews to Galactic media outlets who wanted to know everything about the human who had broken a 200-year record. He tried to stay humble in his responses and emphasized that his success was not about individual superiority but about the unique perspective that came from growing up on a Deathworld. Danny explained in interview after interview that humans were not stronger or smarter than other species, but they had one critical advantage, which was that Earth had been training them for hostile environments since before recorded history. Other candidates had approached Terminus 9 as an abnormal challenge that required extraordinary effort to overcome. Danny had approached it as normal, because, to him, a Deathworld was just home with different scenery. The interviews made him uncomfortable because he did not like being the center of attention, but he understood that his achievement had implications beyond personal glory. If one human could survive the Deathworld trial, then it meant humans in general had capabilities that the galaxy had not recognized. More humans began applying to join the Vanguard and the Coalition military in general, because Danny had shown that humanity could compete. At the highest levels, 3 weeks after his return to the station, Danny attended his formal induction ceremony into the Vanguard, and the hall was filled with warriors from every species in the Coalition. The recruitment center on orbital station Kepler 7 was filled with candidates from every corner of the galaxy, and Danny Morrison stood among them, looking smaller than most and weaker than all. But he did not care about appearances because he knew what he was capable of, and more importantly, he knew what his species was capable of surviving. The line moved slowly as each candidate stepped forward to register for the trial that everyone whispered about in hushed tones and fearful voices, because the Deathworld trial had never been survived by anyone in 200 years, and the planet called Terminus 9 had claimed the lives of 347 warriors from the strongest species in the Galactic Coalition. Danny checked his datapad again, reading the requirements one more time, just to be absolutely certain he understood what he was volunteering for. And the rules were simple in theory but brutal in practice, because candidates would be dropped alone on Terminus 9, with nothing but a basic environmental suit and an emergency beacon, and they would need to survive for 72 hours without any help or support from anyone. The processing officer called him forward, and Danny walked to the desk where a four-armed alien named Krell looked at his application with what seemed like amusement, mixed with disbelief because humans were still relatively new to the Coalition, and most species considered them to be soft creatures from an easy world. Krell spoke through the universal translator system, asking Danny if he truly understood what the Deathworld trial involved. And Danny replied that he did understand completely, because he had studied everything available about Terminus 9, and he knew the survival rate was 0%. And he knew that candidates much stronger than him had failed within the first day. The alien officer leaned forward with his compound eyes gleaming as he explained that the strongest Krathax warriors bred specifically for combat had died on Terminus 9, and that Vendorian hunters with centuries of experience had perished there as well. And he wanted to know what made one human think he could succeed where everyone else had failed so completely. Danny met the officer's gaze without looking away, and he explained calmly that Earth was not exactly the peaceful garden world that most aliens seemed to think it was, because his home planet had its own challenges and dangers that humans dealt with every single day of their lives. Another alien officer approached the desk wearing the crimson insignia of a drill instructor, and his nameplate identified him as Sergeant Vex, and he pulled up information about Earth on a holographic display, and his expression changed from amusement to confusion and then to something that might have been shock. Sergeant Vex started reading the data out loud, and his voice grew louder with each detail he discovered, because Earth had active tectonic plates that caused earthquakes and volcanoes, and it had extreme weather systems that could level entire cities. And it had predator species that hunted in coordinated packs, and it had microscopic organisms invisible to the naked eye that could kill a person in hours. The sergeant continued reading with his voice rising to a shout that silenced the entire recruitment center, because Earth's surface was 70% covered in a liquid that humans could not breathe, and the planet's star bombarded it with radiation constantly, and the gravity was 0.98 standard, which was higher than most civilized worlds. Danny waited patiently while the sergeant processed this information, and then he calmly explained that humans called the liquid water, and they called the radiation sunlight, and some people even enjoyed spending time in it for recreation. Sergeant Vex turned to Krell with all four of his eyes wide in disbelief, and he pointed at the display showing that Earth was rated 9.7 on the hostility index, which made it a Class A death world only slightly less dangerous than Terminus 9 itself. A murmur rippled through the crowd of candidates, and several of them actually stepped away from Danny as if being near a creature from a death world might somehow be contagious or dangerous. The drill sergeant turned back to Danny and demanded to know if he really grew up on a death world and wanted to volunteer for another one, and Danny confirmed that this was correct, and he was fully aware of what he was doing. Sergeant Vex moved closer until he towered over Danny's 6-foot frame, and he spoke in a voice that was clearly meant to intimidate and frighten, because he wanted Danny to understand that no one in the entire history of the Vanguard had ever survived the Deathworld trial, and that Terminus 9 would kill him through its poisonous atmosphere or its predators or its terrain or its weather. Danny listened to the entire speech without changing his expression, and when the sergeant finished, he asked if that speech was meant to scare him away from volunteering. The sergeant replied that it was meant to inform him of reality and help him understand what he was facing. Danny smiled, the kind of small, confident smile that had gotten him into trouble many times back on Earth, and he explained that he understood reality just fine because he grew up in Alaska, where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees, and grizzly bears were considered a minor threat compared to the environment itself. He continued explaining that he had spent 2 years doing search and rescue operations in the Australian outback, where literally everything from the smallest spiders to the plants themselves seemed designed specifically to kill humans, and he had survived a Category 5 hurricane that destroyed everything in its path, and he had lived through a wildfire that burned for 3 solid weeks, and he had even survived dengue fever, which should have killed him, but did not. Danny stepped closer to Sergeant Vex until he had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact, and he spoke clearly so everyone in the recruitment center could hear him, because he wanted them all to understand what made humans different from other species. Explained that Earth had been actively trying to kill humans since they first climbed down from the trees millions of years ago, and humanity had responded by not just surviving, but thriving and spreading across every corner of their planet, from the frozen poles to the hottest deserts to the highest mountains. Danny told the sergeant that he understood the risks completely, and he was still volunteering because that was what humans did when faced with impossible challenges, because humans looked at things that were supposed to be unsurvivable and they tried anyway. Even though they failed often and died frequently, but eventually they succeeded, and when they did, they planted a flag and moved on to the next impossible challenge. The silence in the recruitment center was absolute, and every eye was focused on the human who had just declared his intention to do what no one else had ever accomplished. Sergeant Vex made a sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a growl of respect, and he told Danny that his transport to Terminus 9 would depart in 6 hours, and he should prepare his affairs because this might be the last chance he had to do so. Danny thanked the sergeant and turned to leave, but Vex called out to him one more time and told him that he had trained thousands of warriors over his long career, and he had seen the best fighters from every species in the coalition, and he had watched them all fail the Deathworld trial. Part 4. Danny first noticed something was seriously wrong when all the local fauna started disappearing, and within the span of maybe 30 minutes, the various creatures that had been visible foraging and hunting in the area simply vanished as they retreated into burrows and crevices and hiding places. His search and rescue training back on Earth had taught him a very important lesson, which was that when all the animals suddenly leave an area, there is usually a very good reason for their departure, and humans should pay attention to that warning. He scanned the surrounding terrain with his suit's sensors, looking for whatever threat had spooked the wildlife. But seismic activity appeared normal, and there were no lava flows nearby, and the storm had passed completely. The air felt different somehow, and Danny could not explain exactly what had changed, but his instincts were screaming at him that danger was approaching fast. Then he saw it on the horizon, and his heart sank. A wall of darkness was moving across the landscape, and it was not a storm cloud or volcanic ash, but something else entirely. And as it grew closer, Danny realized with growing horror that it was a swarm. Millions of flying insects were moving as a single, Coordinated mass, and they were stripping everything organic in their path and consuming it. Completely, Danny's suit sensors identified them as a species that the database called shrikes, and they were roughly the size of his fist with razor-sharp mandibles and wings that beat so fast they created a high-pitched buzzing sound that was audible even through his helmet. The swarm was approximately 2 kilometers wide and moving at a steady pace that would bring it directly through his current location in less than 15 minutes. Danny started running because there was no shelter that would protect him from millions of insects that could chew through organic matter, and his environmental suit, while designed to withstand the hostile atmosphere of Terminus 9, was not built to resist a sustained attack from countless cutting mandibles. He ran toward a rocky outcropping he had spotted earlier, hoping that he could find a crevice deep enough to hide in until the swarm passed. Buzzing sound grew louder behind him, and Danny risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he had not. Because the swarm was closer than he had estimated and moving faster than his tired legs could carry him, he was not going to make it to the outcropping in time. Danny's mind raced through possibilities. And then he remembered something from his research about Earth insects, and how many species were attracted to heat and light while others avoided it. He activated every heating element in his environmental suit simultaneously and cranked them to maximum output, and his suit's external temperature began climbing rapidly. The swarm reached him and enveloped him in a living cloud of chittering wings and razor mandibles, and Danny squeezed his eyes shut even though his helmet protected his face. Then something remarkable happened. The insects were avoiding him, and they were flowing around his superheated suit like water around a rock because the extreme temperature was driving them away. Danny stood perfectly still with his suit heating systems running at dangerous levels and creating a protective bubble of heat that the insects refused to cross. The swarm continued past him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, and then they were gone, and the landscape behind them was stripped completely bare of the fungus and small creatures that had been there before. Danny immediately shut down his heating systems before they damaged the suit or depleted his power reserves completely, and he sank to his knees, shaking from adrenaline and relief. The chronometer showed 65 hours and 42 minutes elapsed. 7 hours and 18 minutes remaining. Danny forced himself back to his feet, even though every muscle in his body was screaming in protest, and he started moving again because staying in one place was still too dangerous. He was so close to surviving, and he refused to die now after coming this far. The landscape looked completely different after the swarm had passed through because everything organic had been consumed, and only bare rock remained. Danny's water recycling system had been processing from a sulfur spring when the swarm hit, and he checked it carefully and found that the insects had damaged the intake nozzle. But the main unit was still functional. He made a quick repair with his multi-tool and set the system running again because he needed every drop of water he could get. His food situation was becoming critical because he had consumed most of his emergency rations, and the fungus he had been supplementing with was gone now and eaten by the swarm. 7 more hours and he could eat whatever he wanted. But first, he had to survive 7 more hours. Danny found a sheltered spot between 2 large boulders and settled in to rest because his body desperately needed recovery time, even if his mind was screaming at him to keep moving. He allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. The proximity alarm jerked him awake, and Danny realized with horror that he had fallen asleep without meaning to, and his chronometer showed he had been unconscious for almost 2 hours. Something was moving nearby, and his suit's sensors showed multiple heat signatures approaching from different directions. Danny peered carefully around the boulder and saw them. 3 creatures that looked similar to the pack hunters from his first night, but larger and more heavily armored, and they were clearly working together to surround his position. He was being hunted by something that understood coordinated tactics. Danny evaluated his options quickly, and the creatures had cut off his easiest escape routes, and they were moving with patience and discipline that spoke of significant intelligence. He grabbed his multi-tool and extended the longest blade attachment, and it was a pathetic weapon against 3 armored predators. But it was all he had. The lead creature moved closer, and Danny could see its eyes tracking him with clear intelligence and calculating intent. Then he remembered something Sergeant Vex had told him during the briefing about how most species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds with relatively stable environments, and they had instinctive fear responses to things like fire and extreme temperatures. Danny activated his suit's emergency flare system, which was designed to signal for rescue, but also produced an incredibly bright burst of light and heat. The flare shot into the air above the creatures and exploded in a brilliant white flash that lit up the entire area. The creatures scattered immediately and their coordination broke down completely, as instinctive fear overrode their hunting strategy. Danny did not waste the opportunity, and he ran in the opposite direction while the creatures were still disoriented and confused. He ran until his legs gave out, and he collapsed behind a rock formation, gasping for breath. The chronometer showed 69 hours and 3 minutes elapsed, 2 hours and 57 minutes remaining. Danny laughed because he could not help himself, and the situation was absurd because he had survived a Rexmaw attack and a volcanic eruption, and an earthquake, and an acid storm and a swarm of flesh-eating insects and a coordinated predator pack, less than 3 hours, and he would set a record that had stood for 200 years. The universe apparently was not finished testing him. The ground began to shake, and this was not a minor tremor like before, but a major earthquake that sent massive cracks spreading through the volcanic rock. Danny grabbed onto the nearest stable rock and held on as the world tried to throw him off, and in the distance he could see multiple volcanic vents erupting simultaneously. Lava began flowing from a dozen different sources and converging into rivers of molten rock that were cutting off potential escape routes. The sergeant admitted that he did not expect Danny to be different from all the others who had failed, but he also said that Danny had the spirit of a true vanguard warrior, even if his body seemed inadequate for the task, and that spirit counted. For something important, Danny appreciated the sentiment, but he knew that appreciation would not keep him alive on Terminus 9, and the only thing that mattered was proving through his actions that he could survive. He left the recruitment center, aware that everyone was watching him and whispering about the foolish human who thought he could succeed, where Krathak's warriors had fallen, and where Vendorian hunters had perished. Danny had 6 hours to prepare for a 72-hour trial that had killed every single candidate for 2 centuries, and he intended to use that time wisely. He spent the first hour calling his family back on Earth using the long-range communication system, and his sister Kate answered the call with a mixture of happiness and concern because she had been waiting to hear from him. Kate listened to his explanation of what he was about to attempt, and her reaction was immediate and loud because she told him he was completely insane, and their mother was going to kill him if the Deathworld did not do it first. Danny tried to explain that he knew what he was doing, but Kate interrupted him and asked if he really understood that this was essentially a suicide mission disguised as a military trial. He told her it was not suicide if he planned to survive and intended to come home, and Kate responded by asking what would happen if he ended up like the 347 other candidates who had died. Trying, Danny looked out the viewport at the stars beyond the station, and he told his sister that if he died, he would die doing something that mattered, and something that would prove what humans were capable of accomplishing. But he also made it clear that he was not planning to die, because he was planning to win. Kate went quiet for a long moment before asking if he could really win against an entire planet that was designed to kill everything on it. Danny smiled and explained that humans had been winning against hostile planets for millions of years, and they just called the process evolution and adaptation. His sister asked if he was really going through with this, no matter what she said, and Danny confirmed that he was absolutely committed to attempting the trial. Kate made him promise that he would come home alive, and Danny told her honestly that he could promise to try his absolute hardest, but that was the only promise he could make because he could not control everything that might happen on Terminus 9. After the call ended, Danny spent the next 4 hours doing what he had always done best, which was preparing thoroughly for whatever challenge lay ahead. He researched every available piece of information about Terminus 9 and memorized terrain, patterns and weather cycles and known predator behaviors, and he reviewed survival techniques from Earth and adapted them mentally for the alien environment he would face. He stretched his muscles and meditated to calm his mind, and ran through countless scenarios in his head, imagining different situations and how he would respond to each one. The briefing room was smaller than he expected, and he was the only candidate present, which made sense because most people who volunteered for the Deathworld trial did so alone without wanting an audience for their final preparations. Sergeant Vex stood at the front of the room beside a holographic display of Terminus 9, and he admitted that he had expected Danny to reconsider his decision. During the 6 hours of preparation time, Danny replied that reconsidering was not his style, and the sergeant seemed to accept this because he activated the holographic display and began explaining what Danny would face. The planet had a rotational period of 31 standard hours and gravity of 1.1 standard, which would put additional strain on Danny's body with every movement, and the atmosphere was technically breathable, but contained high levels of sulfur compounds and methane. That would cause constant respiratory irritation. The hologram showed various terrain features while Sergeant Vex explained that Terminus 9 was dominated by volcanic activity, with lava flows that were common and completely unpredictable, and the fauna had evolved to be exceptionally aggressive because resources were scarce and competition was intense. The largest predator documented on Terminus 9 was called a Rex Maw, and it was approximately 15 meters in length with armored hide thick, enough to withstand extreme temperatures, and it had venom that caused complete neural paralysis in under 30 seconds. Danny interrupted to ask how fast the Rex Maw could run, because speed was an important factor in determining whether he could outmaneuver it or whether he would need to find another strategy. Sergeant Vex checked his data and reported that the Rex Maw could reach speeds of 60 kilometers per hour in short bursts, which was fast enough to catch almost any prey on the car. Planet Danny asked if the creature could climb, and the sergeant replied that there were no documented observations of climbing behavior, but it was theorized to be capable of climbing shallow inclines at least. These details were exactly what Danny needed to know because understanding a predator's capabilities and limitations was essential to surviving an encounter with it. He asked about water sources, and the sergeant explained that there were sulfur springs and acid pools scattered across the planet, and the environmental suit could process these into drinking water, though the taste would be extremely unpleasant. Danny replied that he could handle unpleasant tastes because being uncomfortable was far better than being dead from dehydration. The drop zone would be on the equatorial plateau at dawn, and the area was relatively stable, though storms were frequent and could appear with little warning. The emergency beacon would activate automatically after 72 hours, or if the suit detected critical life sign failure. But activating it before the time limit would result in automatic disqualification and permanent ban from Vanguard service. Sergeant Vex asked Danny one final time if he was certain he wanted to proceed, and he explained that there was no shame in recognizing when a challenge exceeded someone's capabilities. Danny stood up and met the sergeant's gaze, and he thanked him for the concern, but made it absolutely clear that he was not backing down because his species had not conquered Earth by playing it safe and avoiding danger. The sergeant pointed out that humans had not actually conquered their home world, but merely lived upon it. Danny smiled and suggested that maybe this was the key difference between humans and other species, because humans did not just live on Deathworlds, but they thrived on them, and adapted to them, and made them into homes, even if that meant learning to love the things that were constantly trying to kill them. Sergeant Vex stared at Danny for a long moment and then performed a gesture that Danny recognized from his research as a Vendorian salute, and he told Danny to go and show the galaxy what a true Deathworlder was capable of accomplishing. 2 hours later, Danny stood in the dropship's deployment bay, sealed inside an environmental suit that felt both too bulky and not protective enough, and through the viewport he could see Terminus 9 growing larger and more threatening with every passing second. The planet looked angry, with its surface covered in reds and yellows and oranges and clouds that resembled smoke more than water vapor. The pilot was a crystalline being named Crystal Song, who spoke through the communication system and announced that they were approaching the drop zone, and weather conditions were acceptable, and volcanic activity was rated as moderate. Crystal Song admitted that she had piloted insertion runs for 43 candidates over her career, and she had watched their life signs extinguish one by one over the hours and days that followed, and she did not want to watch Danny's life signs do the same thing Danny told her not to watch then, because he planned to make this boring for her by spending 72 hours doing absolutely nothing except surviving. A sound that might have been crystalline laughter came through the communication system, and then Crystal Song announced 30 seconds to drop. Danny gripped the deployment handles and took a deep breath of filtered air, and through the viewport he could see the plateau where he would land, surrounded by ridges and valleys and volcanic vents. The countdown continued, and Danny felt his heart rate increase, but his mind remained calm and focused because this was the moment he had been preparing for. 10 seconds remaining, and he could see the toxic gases rising from the vents below. 5 seconds, and he thought about all the candidates who had died attempting this same trial. The bay doors opened and Danny fell toward the Deathworld below with that same small, confident smile on his face. He thought to himself that everyone should watch carefully because he was about to survive something that no one had survived in 200 years. The earthquake lasted for 45 seconds, but it felt like it went on for hours. And when it finally stopped, Danny immediately assessed the damage to himself and his equipment. His suit had multiple small tears from flying glass fragments, but the self-sealing mechanism had already detected and patched them automatically, and he had a cut on his left arm where a particularly sharp shard had penetrated before the suit sealed, but the wound was shallow and not immediately dangerous. What concerned him far more was the thick black smoke rising from the western horizon, because the earthquake had triggered another volcanic eruption, and this one was much closer than the previous eruption had been. Danny's sensors showed a lava flow, beginning approximately 3 kilometers away, and the molten rock was moving steadily in his general direction. He had to keep moving and get away from the approaching danger. Danny gathered his supplies quickly and began working his way east through the shattered remains of the crystalline forest and moving away from the volcanic activity. As he traveled, he noticed something interesting about the local fauna, because they were all moving in the same direction he was, and they were fleeing the lava flow just like he was. Predator and prey alike were all driven by the same fundamental survival instinct to escape from the molten rock that would kill everything in its path. Among the fleeing creatures, Danny spotted another Rexmaw, and it might have been the same individual from the previous night, or it might have been a different one. But either way, the massive predator was moving at a steady lope and completely ignoring the smaller animals around it, because escape was more important than hunting. For several strange hours, Danny traveled alongside an exodus of alien life, and there was an unspoken truce enforced by mutual danger, because nothing wanted to waste energy fighting when survival required all their focus. He saw creatures he had never encountered before, including something that looked like a 6-legged elk with antlers, made of the same crystalline material as the forest, and a swarm of flying insects whose bodies actually glowed red-hot like tiny embers, and a serpentine creature that moved through the rocks like water flowing downhill. The sheer diversity of life on Terminus 9 was absolutely staggering, and the planet was actively trying to kill everything that lived on its surface. Yet life not only persisted but actually thrived in this hostile environment. Just like on Earth, where life had found ways to survive and flourish in every environment, from the frozen Arctic to the scorching Sahara Desert to the crushing depths of the ocean, Danny found himself smiling despite his bone-deep exhaustion, because this was exactly what he had tried to explain to Sergeant Vex back at the orbital station. Deathworlds did not create weakness, but instead they forged incredible strength, because every single organism on Terminus 9 was a survivor that had been shaped by millions of years of relentless hostility into something resilient and tenacious and adaptable. Humans were no different from these alien creatures, because Earth had been trying to kill humanity since the species first evolved, and humans had responded by spreading across the entire planet and adapting to absolutely every environment they encountered. The lava flow finally stopped its advance around sunset as the molten rock cooled and solidified into new terrain that would eventually weather and break down and become part of the landscape. The exodus of creatures slowed and then stopped completely, and predators and prey began eyeing each other with renewed interest. Now that the immediate emergency had passed, Danny found a new shelter in a depression between rocks that was partially shielded by a large boulder, and he set up his water processing system one more time and settled in for his second night on Terminus 9. The chronometer showed 43 hours elapsed, which meant he had 29 hours remaining until the emergency beacon activated automatically. His body was reaching its absolute limits because the increased gravity was taking a serious toll and making every single movement require extra effort, and his food supplies were running dangerously low, even supplemented by the fungus he had found. The cuts and bruises from the earthquake were minor individually, but together they created a constant background of pain that made rest difficult. But he was still alive and still functional and still fighting, and that was what mattered most. The second night passed more peacefully than the first because the bioluminescent pack hunters appeared again, but they kept their distance and seemed to remember his aggressive display from the previous night. Dawn of the third day brought a new set of challenges because a massive storm system rolled in from the north, bringing winds that howled through the rocks like a living thing and rain that was acidic enough to slowly corrode the outer surface of his environmental suit. Danny was forced to take shelter deep in a cave system and wait out the worst of the weather, while his suit's integrity slowly degraded. The storm raged for 6 brutal hours before finally breaking, and when Danny emerged cautiously, the entire landscape had changed again because flash floods had carved new channels through the volcanic rock, and several landmarks he had been using for navigation were simply gone. He checked his chronometer and felt a surge of hope. 62 hours elapsed, which meant only 10 hours remained until he completed the trial. Danny allowed himself to feel cautious optimism because he was in the final stretch, and if he could just avoid any major catastrophes for the next 10 hours, he would become the first being in 200 years to survive the Deathworld trial. The universe apparently decided to test that confidence immediately. The shaking continued for over a minute, and when it finally stopped, Danny found himself on a small island of stable rock surrounded on 3 sides by slowly advancing lava flows. He had maybe 30 minutes before the lava reached his position, and there was only one direction he could go, which was toward a steep ridge that looked almost impossible to climb. Danny approached the ridge and examined it carefully, and the rock face was nearly vertical and approximately 20 meters high, and his exhausted body would need to climb it while fighting against increased gravity. He started climbing because there was no other choice. Every handhold was a struggle, and every meter gained felt like a victory. And the heat from the lava behind him was growing more intense with each passing minute. Danny's arms trembled with exhaustion and his fingers were cramping, and the suit's medical monitors were flashing warnings about dangerous muscle fatigue and elevated core temperature. He was halfway up the ridge when his left hand slipped, and for a terrifying moment he hung by one hand over the lava below. Danny forced his left hand back to the rock face and found a new grip and continued climbing with tears of pain and frustration running down his face inside his helmet. He reached the top of the ridge and pulled himself over the edge and lay there gasping and shaking. The chronometer showed 71 hours and 38 minutes elapsed, 22 minutes remaining. Danny stood up on shaking legs and looked around, and he was on a high plateau that appeared stable and relatively safe. He found a flat spot and sat down to wait because 22 minutes was nothing after everything he had endured. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Danny watched the chronometer count down 10 minutes remaining, and he allowed himself to believe he might actually survive. 5 minutes remaining, and he started thinking about what he would say to Sergeant Vex. 1 minute remaining, and Danny Morrison smiled that same confident smile he had worn when he first volunteered. The emergency beacon activated automatically at exactly 72 hours and began transmitting his location and vital signs to the orbiting ship. Crystal Song's voice came through the communication system, and she sounded genuinely shocked. She told him that his vital signs showed he was alive and relatively stable, and a rescue shuttle was launching immediately. Danny replied that he had told her this would be boring for her because he had planned to spend 72 hours doing nothing, except surviving. Crystal Song made that crystalline laughing sound, and told him that his definition of boring was very different from hers. The rescue shuttle arrived within 20 minutes, and Danny climbed aboard on legs that barely functioned. The pilot was a young Krathax warrior who stared at Danny with something approaching awe. As the shuttle lifted off from Terminus 9, Danny looked down at the planet that had tried so hard to kill him, and he felt an odd sense of gratitude. The Deathworld had tested him and pushed him to his absolute limits, and he had survived. He had proven that humans belonged among the stars. He had proven that Deathworlders were survivors, and most importantly, he had kept his promise to his sister Kate. He was going home. Part 2. The landing hit Danny harder than he expected, and even though his environmental suit had shock absorbers built into the legs and feet, he still felt the impact jarring through his entire body as he slammed into the volcanic rock of Terminus 9, and for a moment he just lay there catching his breath and letting his body recover from the violent arrival. The heads-up display inside his helmet immediately started feeding him information about his new environment and the external temperature. Read 43 degrees Celsius and atmospheric pressure was 1.2 standard, and radiation levels were elevated, but still within the suit's tolerance range, which meant he would not die immediately from environmental exposure. Danny forced himself to stand and began scanning the plateau in all directions to get a sense of what he was dealing with. And the landscape was exactly as hostile as the briefing had described, with black and red volcanic rocks stretching away in every direction, broken only by steam vents that hissed and spat toxic gases into the already poisonous atmosphere. In the distance, maybe a kilometer or two away, he could see what looked like a forest made entirely of crystalline formations that might be volcanic, glass-shaped by the extreme temperatures into strange and beautiful shapes. Crystal Song's voice came through the communication system, confirming that the insertion had been successful and his emergency beacon was active and tracking his location, and she wished him good luck in a tone that suggested she thought he would need far more than luck to survive. Danny thanked her for the ride, and she replied that she would be monitoring from orbit, and if he needed emergency extraction before the 72 hours were complete, he should activate the beacon manually. He told her firmly that would not happen, and he appreciated the safety net, but he had no intention of using it. The communication went silent, and Danny was suddenly alone on a planet that had killed every single person who had ever set foot on its surface. His first priority had to be finding shelter because the environmental suit would protect him from the atmosphere and regulate his body temperature, but it would not save him from a lava flow or from being attacked by one of the deadly predators that called this planet home. The plateau offered almost no natural cover but approximately 300 meters to the north. Danny spotted an outcropping of rock that had an overhang which might provide at least some protection from the elements and from being exposed on all sides to whatever might be hunting him. He started walking toward it, and he was careful to test each step before putting his full weight down because the rock might look stable, but this was an active volcanic world, and what appeared solid could actually be a thin crust over a pocket of magma. The increased gravity was immediately noticeable, and every step felt like he was carrying an extra 20 pounds of weight, and by the time he reached the outcropping, his legs were burning with effort, and his breathing had increased. Though the suit's readouts showed his heart rate was elevated, but not yet in the danger zone, the overhang turned out to be better than he had hoped, because the rock formation created a small cave that was maybe 3 meters deep and 2 meters high, and Danny scanned it carefully with his suit's sensors, checking for any signs of current habitation by local creatures or structural instability that might cause a collapse. When nothing flagged as immediately dangerous, he entered the cave and set down his small pack of emergency supplies, which contained rations and a water recycling unit and basic medical supplies and a multi-tool. And it was not much to survive 3 days on a Deathworld, but it was better than having nothing at all. Danny activated the water extraction system and placed the intake nozzle near one of the sulfur springs. He had passed on his way to the cave, and the system hummed to life, beginning the process of filtering and processing the toxic water into something he could drink without dying. And it would take about an hour to produce a liter of water, which meant he would need to ration very carefully. While the water system worked, Danny went back outside to survey the immediate area more thoroughly and get a better sense of the terrain and potential hazards in the crystalline forest he had spotted. From the landing site was still visible about a kilometer away, and between his current position and that forest, the terrain was relatively flat, but dotted with steam vents and small pools of bubbling liquid that his sensors identified as highly acidic. Movement in his peripheral vision made Danny freeze instantly, and about 50 meters away something was scuttling between the rocks, and it was roughly the size of a large dog, with 6 legs, and what appeared to be armored plating covering its entire body. The creature paused in its movement and raised what might have been its head, and seemed to be sensing the air, trying to determine if Danny was prey or predator, or something else entirely. Danny remained perfectly motionless because sudden movement might trigger an attack response, and he did not yet know if this creature was dangerous or just curious. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the creature scuttled away and disappeared into a crevice. Between 2 large rocks, Danny let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and made a mental note that the local fauna was active during the day cycle, and he would need to remain constantly vigilant. He returned to his shelter and checked the water recycling system, which had produced about 1/4 of a liter, and he transferred it to the suit's internal reservoir and took a small sip, and the taste was exactly as unpleasant as Sergeant Vex had warned him it would be, with a metallic flavor mixed with something that reminded him strongly of rotten eggs, but it was hydration. And that was what mattered. Danny pulled up the chronometer built into his suit's display and saw that 2 hours and 17 minutes had elapsed since landing, which meant he had 69 hours and 43 minutes remaining. The sensible strategy would be to stay in this shelter and conserve his energy and simply wait out the 72 hours. But Danny knew from his research that every candidate who had tried a passive survival strategy had died, because Terminus 9 did not allow for passive survival, since the planet was too active and too volatile, and staying in one place just meant being there when a lava flow redirected toward you or when predators tracked your scent to your location. He needed to think like a predator himself and keep moving and stay unpredictable and make the planet adapt to him, instead of adapting to the planet. Danny spent the next several hours exploring in a widening radius around his primary shelter and carefully mapping the terrain in his mind and identifying potential hazards that he needed to avoid and potential resources that he could use. He found 3 more sulfur springs and 2 additional rock outcroppings that could serve as backup shelters if he needed to relocate quickly, and he also found what looked like a dried stream bed that might offer easier travel if he needed to cover distance in a hurry. He also found evidence that previous candidates had been here, and the first piece of evidence was a torn scrap of fabric that was faded and burned by the acidic atmosphere, and it was caught on a sharp rock outcropping, and Danny recognized it as Krathak's combat gear, which was designed to withstand conditions that would shred human clothing into ribbons, and whatever had torn it had done so with tremendous force. The second piece of evidence was more disturbing because it was a helmet that was cracked and partially melted, lying in a shallow depression in the rocks, and Danny approached it carefully and scanned it with his suit, and the biological signs recorded inside showed the last moments of a Vendorian warrior named Cax 21, whose life signs had ceased approximately 8 months ago, roughly 19 hours into the trial. Danny touched the ruined helmet briefly in a gesture of respect, and he spoke quietly, even though no one could hear him, and he told the dead warrior that he was sorry they had not made it, and he would try to do better. The ground trembled as if in response to his words, and it was not a major earthquake but just a subtle vibration that made small rocks dance and skip across the surface, and Danny checked his suit's seismic sensors and saw elevated activity to the west, indicating a volcanic eruption maybe 5 kilometers away. The tremor lasted about 15 seconds and then subsided, and Danny made a mental note to avoid approaching from the western direction. Night fell with shocking speed on Terminus 9, and with the darkness came a dramatic temperature drop, and the external thermometer showed a plunge from 43 degrees Celsius to 18 degrees in less than an hour, and the suit compensated easily, but Danny could see frost forming on the exposed rock surfaces around him. He returned to his primary shelter and settled in, knowing that sleep would be difficult, but absolutely necessary, because his body needed rest to function, and he could not afford to let exhaustion compromise his judgment or his reflexes. The suit had a sleep monitoring system that would alert him to immediate dangers, but it was not foolproof. And Danny knew that many candidates had probably died in their sleep, killed by threats they never detected. He set the suit's alarm to wake him every 90 minutes, which would give him a chance to check his surroundings while still getting some rest, and it would make for a rough night. But he had gone much longer with far less sleep during his search and rescue operations back on Earth. The first wake-up call came exactly 90 minutes later, and Danny jerked awake immediately, checking all his sensors for threats, and nothing appeared to be in the immediate vicinity, and the temperature had dropped another 3 degrees, and he could hear sounds outside the shelter, including clicking and scraping noises that suggested the nocturnal fauna were beginning their hunting activities. He reset the timer and tried to sleep again, though it took several minutes for his racing heart to slow down enough. The second wake-up was completely different and far more alarming. Danny's eyes snapped open to the sound of his suit's proximity alarm, which meant something was moving very close to the entrance of his shelter, and the suit's low-light cameras showed a creature that was roughly twice the size of the one he had seen during the day, and it had 8 legs instead of 6. and appeared to be covered in some kind of bioluminescent pattern that pulsed with an eerie blue light. The creature approached the shelter entrance very slowly and cautiously, with its front legs testing the ground ahead of it, and Danny remained absolutely still and barely breathed while his hand slowly moved toward the multi-tool attached to his waist. The creature's head swung in his direction, and multiple eyes reflected the faint light from his suit's internal displays, and for a long, terrible moment, predator and prey assessed each other in silence. Then the creature made a sound, which was a low clicking that seemed to echo off the rock walls of the shelter, and another creature appeared behind it, and then another, and Danny realized with growing alarm that he was looking at a coordinated pack of hunters, and they had just found something very interesting. The lead creature took one step into the shelter. Danny moved faster than he had ever moved in his life, and he activated the suit's external lights at maximum brightness, which flooded the shelter entrance with intense white illumination, and the creatures recoiled, immediately scrambling backward with their bioluminescent patterns flashing rapidly in what might have been confusion or pain. Danny lunged forward, making himself as large as possible and shouting at the top of his lungs, even though the creatures could not hear him through the environmental suit. But the aggressive display combined with the sudden light was enough. The creatures retreated rapidly and disappeared into the darkness beyond his shelter, but Danny knew with absolute certainty that they would be back, because now they knew he was here, and they would wait patiently for another opportunity to attack. He could not stay in this shelter any longer, because it had been compromised. Danny quickly gathered all his supplies and purged the water recycling system to save the accumulated drinking water, and prepared to move, even though moving at night was extremely risky. The suit's chronometer showed 14 hours and 32 minutes elapsed since landing. Moving at night was dangerous, but staying here was guaranteed death, and Danny had not come this far to die because he was too afraid to take a calculated risk. He activated the suit's external lights in a narrow, forward-focused beam and stepped out of the shelter into the alien night, and the volcanic plateau looked completely different in darkness, with bioluminescent creatures everywhere, creating a surreal landscape of moving lights, and the steam vents glowed orange from the heat beneath them, casting dancing shadows across the rocks. Danny oriented himself using the suit's navigation system and began moving toward the crystalline forest he had spotted earlier, because if he could reach it before dawn, he might find better shelter among those formations. The journey was terrifying because every shadow could hide a predator, and every sound could be something hunting him, and the bioluminescent creatures tracked his movement, keeping pace about 20 meters away, just waiting for him to make a mistake or show weakness. Danny focused on putting one foot in front of the other and maintaining a steady pace that would not exhaust him, but would keep him moving forward toward relative safety. He was halfway to the crystalline forest when he heard a sound that made his blood turn cold in his veins. A roar erupted from somewhere behind him, and it was deep and resonant and seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet, and the bioluminescent creatures scattered instantly, disappearing into crevices and under rocks with a speed that told him they knew exactly what had made that sound. Danny turned slowly and saw it silhouetted against the glow of a distant lava flow, and it was massive, at least 15 meters long, with armored hide gleaming in the firelight, and it moved with predatory grace. Despite its enormous size, Rex Maw, the apex predator of Terminus 9, had found him, and it was hunting. Sergeant Vex presented him with the crimson insignia of the Vanguard and announced to everyone present that Danny Morrison of Earth had demonstrated the core values of courage and adaptability and determination that defined what it meant to be Vanguard. The assembled warriors saluted him in their various traditional ways, and Danny felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, because he was no longer just representing himself, but representing all of humanity. After the ceremony, a young Krathax warrior approached Danny nervously and asked if the stories about Earth were really true. Danny smiled and told the warrior that every story about Earth was true and probably understated because his homeworld had dangers that most species could not even imagine. The Krathax asked why humans would ever leave such a terrible place. Danny's smile widened, and he explained that humans left Earth for the same reason they did everything else, which was because it was there, and because it was hard, and because someone said it was impossible. Humans were not content to simply survive on their Deathworld. and they wanted to see what else was out there in the universe. And now that they had found the Galactic community, they intended to prove themselves worthy of being part of it. The Krathax warrior seemed to consider this, and then asked if Danny thought more humans would attempt the Deathworld trial. Danny replied that he would be surprised if they did not, because now that one human had succeeded, others would see it as a challenge to meet or exceed. That was how humans worked, and they were competitive by nature and always pushing each other to achieve more. 6 months later, Danny heard that another human had volunteered for the Deathworld trial and had survived with even fewer injuries than Danny had sustained. Then another human succeeded, and then another. Within 2 years, humans made up 30% of all Vanguard graduates. And the Deathworld trial survival rate had jumped from 0% to 47% overall, with humans accounting for most of the successes. The galaxy was slowly learning what Danny had tried to tell Sergeant Vex from the very beginning. Deathworlders were different, and what seemed impossible to species from safe, stable planets was just another day for beings who evolved, dodging predators and surviving disasters and adapting to environments that actively tried to kill them. Danny Morrison continued to serve in the Vanguard with distinction and eventually rose to the rank of instructor, where he taught survival techniques to new candidates. And every time he sent someone to Terminus 9, he told them the same thing. Sergeant Vex had told him no one had ever survived the Deathworld trial until someone did, and that someone proved that impossible was just a word people used for things they had not accomplished yet.